So I'm here with Peter Worley, and we're going to talk about the philosophical consultation. So according to you, what is a philosophical consultation?
Yeah, I'd say very simply put, is the application of philosophy and the philosophy's tools and concepts to our lives, to us as individuals, as people, and also our place in the world. So broadly speaking, something like that.
Sometimes we define it by saying what it not is. Sometimes we say it's not therapy, for
Indeed,
example.
indeed. And this, of course, has its benefits. This is quite a good way of approaching things sometimes. But there's also something slightly evasive about that. Saying what something is not, of course, doesn't say what it is. But I'd say if I were to say something else, I might say something like philosophical counseling is a process through which the philosophical counselor supports clients, broadly understood, in achieving a better philosophical understanding of themselves and of their lives. So I would say that that's a kind of the definition that I would start with if I were to give one.
Yeah. Okay, so it's understanding real life issues, real life problems.
Yeah, I think this is the key thing. Understanding and clarifying are two very important parts of philosophical approach,
Yeah.
uh, as I understand it and as I use it. Uh,
Would you say that you're not in the business of solving problems rather than investigating, clarifying, understanding problems?
well, I think it's what I would not do is make the solving of the problem the aim and the promise. I think this is important. It can sometimes be the aim of the client to solve a problem, but I would say that the philosophical counseling is just one thing that might help them do that. So there is an asymmetry in the aim there, but this has to be, I think, clarified at the beginning. So what is it you want to get out of this session? Or when someone says, I want to solve a problem and they name it, like I want to decide whether to get married or not, uh, then of course it can't promise to, the philosophical consultation cannot promise to answer that. And it cannot promise to solve or resolve that problem. But it may do. But I think there's a sense in which the aims of the client are broader. Their aim is to think, how do I solve this problem? And philosophy, uh, I think the best it can do is say, look, what we will probably achieve. You notice I say probably is some clarity and some understanding of the issue.
So who would benefit from a philosophical consultation? You think it's anyone, or maybe some people would be better doing something else? So what's your take on this?
If we just take the understanding and clarification aspect of what we're talking about, which I've obviously put as quite central, then anyone can understand something better and anyone can clarify better. And in that sense, anyone can benefit from a consultation which helps you to understand and clarify. So I would say that, yeah, I would say that anyone in a broad sense. However, of course, there are all sorts of further contexts and circumstances where you need to think a little bit less broadly. So, for instance, it might be that philosophy can help anyone, but it could also be the case that engaging in philosophical counseling or consultancy could harm someone more, and in which case you might not recommend it. And I think one has to be very careful with regard to things like clinical depression, for instance, uh, or something like pathological, like an addiction. So in those cases, if somebody's an alcoholic and they want to give up alcohol, then I might say, look, there's a sense in which thinking about this philosophically might help. But a very important aspect of this is addressing the medical, the clinical aspect of this. And philosophy certainly can't do that, I would say. Or at least we're not qualified to do that, let's say. So then the question is, well, do we still think that the person's attitude is such that they may be able to gain something from a philosophical analysis and approach when thinking about a problem like alcoholism, if they can and they understand, that we're doing this as a supplement to other approaches which might be more primary in this particular context, then I don't see why it can't be done. But we need to really spell out exactly where it lies in that spectrum of things that they may be approaching and or including to tackle the problem more broadly. So these are the sorts of things I would, and I might even, and I have done this, worked in uh, coordination with another practitioner. So in the past, when I have worked in situations where there is also a medical concern or a psychological concern, then I've been put in touch with the client's psychologist in order to sort of coordinate a little bit on what we're both doing.
Very different approaches to this from different practitioners. I know some people say I would never, have a discussion with someone who's clinically depressed, for instance. I would refer them to a psychiatrist, something like that. Some people would say, well, no problem. I work with anyone, so there's no.
Oh,
No.
well, I wouldn't say either of those things. I
Mm.
wouldn't say there's no problem, and I wouldn't say I'd never. So, those are two extreme positions. But no, I think the situation will be very much context dependent. Um, so there's a number of things to consider. If I'm working with someone who's young, a teenager, for instance, then this is all discussed with the relevant medical professionals, psychological professionals, and parents. And we talk about what we might be able to achieve. And if I think it's not something that philosophical counseling can help with, I'll very quickly say so. Or if I think there's other things that are just much more important that need to be dealt with first, I'll say so. I think this is a very context dependent situation.
Can you say something about your method? What makes it philosophical? You said you clarify, for instance. But if you can go into some specifics with what happens in a consultation with you, what makes this a philosophical discussion rather than, say, a psychological discussion or something else?
Right. Well, let's say first of all, it's dialectical, and by dialectical, I mean it in the sort of Socratic sense, the sort of back and forth that there is in a conversation between, well, it could be one person, it could be doing a back and forth with yourself, but I think in this kind of context, it is at least with one person, maybe more. I'd say it's a systematic approach to exploring opinions and ideas using that back and forth question answer approach that we see in Socrates. So we're not just, as I think Socrates himself says, it's not just idle chat, but broadly speaking, it uses basic logical moves in language to explore ideas. So very simply, uh, um, I describe something I call the talk triangle, or the philosophical triangle, or the dialectical triangle. And Parmenides said that the conditions for dialectic are that we can think and we can speak. So think and speak are at one corner and the other. And I've included listen because I think the basic conditions for dialectic are that we think, speak, and listen. And I'm providing the conditions for those three things to happen. And I have very many techniques and strategies for allowing that basic mechanism to unfold, develop, and in some cases progress.
Yeah. And where does or how, if does the ethical aspect come into this? I know again, practitioners are different. Some are very concerned with uh, care, caring about the client, not causing any undue trauma or whatever. Some are more direct, more challenging, doesn't care so much about the person's feeling that you have in front of them. So, how do you think about this?
Yes, it's a good question. And I think there are lots of different aspects to this that we have to consider. There is the personality of the person doing it. I think that's to some extent unavoidable. If you happen to be the sort of person who cares for the person in front of you, it's very difficult to stop doing so. However, of course, there's professional ways in which one can manage that. So there are professional considerations. And then, of course, there's the philosophical aspect of it. And the philosophical aspect of it is itself the sort of thing that we might consider a subject of investigation. And that, of course, is an interesting thing in itself. And because my basic approach is to elicit, to draw from in the Socratic um, approach. Now, when I say Socratic approach, I'm going to qualify that. I distinguish between the theoretic, what I call ideal practice, and any other kinds of practice, which varies hugely. So, in other words, Socrates describes his practice ideally and tries to outline what it is he's doing methodologically in the Theaetetus rather well and clearly. But then we can also look at what he actually does in the other dialogues, and what we see is not always in line with his ideal practice. So I distinguish between those two. And what I do is much closer to the ideal practice he describes in the Theaetetus, where he's saying people, think I'm not really doing anything, where I'm not. He says I'm not asking, I'm not telling them what I think. I'm simply giving birth to their ideas using the midwifery metaphor. So, given that I'm working in this way, it just practically works better if I take a more soft approach and draw from out of them. And if I become too aggressive or too challenging and testing, they close down. So if I want to draw from them, I need them to trust me. I need them to feel comfortable, and I need them to feel as though I'm not going to ridicule or in any way trip them up, and then
Mm.
they tend to be more open. So it's that kind of theoretic model of maieutic and eliciting model. And I just tend to find that if you are caring, then you get more in that sense.
Mm.
But that doesn't, of course, mean you can't test. That doesn't, of course, mean that there isn't a situation or where you challenge more, where you probe more. There's a context for all of these approaches. And I have an approach you might be interested in, which, as far as I'm aware, is unique to my practice. But of course, tell me if this is not true. And it's something I call mode of engagement. So I distinguish between a default mode of engagement, which is much more what I would call absent, where I'm not saying what I think. I'm not interpreting what the client says. I simply use logical structures to get more from them. So if they say something, I don't say, so what you're saying is, or what you mean is. I will simply say, when you say this, can you say what you mean by? Or when you say this, can you say why you think that? These are logical structures, justification, clarification, and so on. And the idea is to keep me out of it, right? So there's a sort of absence principle that I'm using here. Now, that's the default mode of engagement, and a mode of engagement which is absent and performing mainly a structural role to help elicit those ideas more and so on.
Okay, so you don't reformulate the ideas, you don't put ideas in the mouth of the other.
Not in this default mode. No, that's right. Exactly. Just deliberately avoid doing so. Much more in the clean language model that you may be familiar with of using. So you sort of tidy up your language. I don't reformulate or reinterpret. I want them to be able to construct from something less clear to something more clear through a questioning process to construct their own meaning as a starting point. So that's the default. However, of course, this can be very limiting. Doing this sometimes can be frustrating. Maybe I have an important insight that I think they really need to hear, or something like that. Maybe I think we need to test this idea more because they're clearly not able to do that themselves, right? So they're not able to challenge this. Now, there are tools we can use. So we can use specific tools like, okay, let's apply the tool of, say, spotting assumptions. It's one thing we can do. Um, but there's also other modes of engagement that we can employ. For instance, I can take a more heuristic mode in the Socratic model. So I said to you earlier that we've got the ideal practice, but there's also lots of other examples of practice in Socrates' dialogues that we see given to us by Plato. One mode is heuristic. In other words, uh, a more combative
Mm.
or testing mode. And actually, sometimes that heuristic mode is useful. It can be a really good tool. So in this situation, what I'd do is I would let them know that there are different modes of engagement. And we discuss between us which mode we employ, which mode we go into. But then we delineate. That's a D hyphen lineate. Um, and I'm trying to think of the D's now, but the first one is to declare, to discuss, to decide, and then to debrief. So declaring is right. I think these are the modes of engagement we've got. This is the one that I think might be useful, for instance, or let's discuss which one we think will be useful. And then let's try that mode of engagement for, say, a set period of time. So for this set period of time, I'm going to be much more testing, much more, interrogative and so on, because I'm going to be using this more heuristic style. And I might even give them a Socratic dialogue to show them the sort of thing I mean. And then we try it and then we stop and we debrief back into the default mode, a more absent mode. And what this enables us to do is it enables us to step into different modes to get the benefits of those modes without constantly either constantly inhabiting it as a kind of personality or idiosyncratic default, which I see quite a lot in the practice that I've seen, um, or stepping into this bland state of constant neutrality,
Mm.
which can also be frustrating. But the point is, we have a debrief. Okay, how was it? Do we think? How do you feel about it? For instance, are you? Oh, I feel really, really stressed, actually. For instance, or I feel stressed, but I really feel as though it was fruitful. Right? Okay, why? Let's think about that, and so on.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
What I've seen before is, of course, people move or practitioners move between different modes of engagement, but I haven't seen it like they tell the client, okay, okay, now we're going to switch to another one and do it such a transparent way. Then debriefing it afterwards, I haven't seen that before.
right. Okay. Well, that's helpful. So, um, so that's the idea is that we have a kind of default setting, which I suppose is in a very soft, neutral way. But in order to avoid the limitations of that approach, we have access to others. Um, and they can be different. So, for instance, it might be a historical mode. Okay, well, what might the existentialists say, or what might the Stoics say? Well, I could put a voice forward, saying, especially if the client's not an expert in this stuff, and say, right, well, this is what the Stoics might say here, or this is what the existentialists might say. Let's spend some time on that. But we know what role I'm playing here. I'm not doing this because I want to say it. I'm doing this because, and this is an important aspect, the motivation. Why is it I'm doing what I'm doing? I think the counselor always needs to ask themselves, when they do something, why are they doing it? Is it to, for instance, if I'm doing a public display of my practice in front of a whole bunch of people, am I saying what I just said because I'm trying to get a laugh? That would be a good question to ask. And I don't think it would be a good reason to do something.
Mm.
Trying to get a laugh, or I'm trying to be in some sort of rhetorical mode. So then you've always got to ask yourself, why is it you're doing this move? And I think the basic rule is, as long as you're doing this to further the dialectic, in the interests of the philosophical dialectical furtherance of this discussion, getting deeper and so on, then I think that's a good reason for doing whatever it is you're doing. But if you're doing it to make someone laugh, to make a point, to make yourself look good, or anything like that, or to show off what you know about
You
someone,
could be doing it for yourself.
you're doing it for yourself. Exactly. So this is the key thing. Am I doing this to further the dialectical discussion, the interests of the discussion?
Yeah.
I will say one thing about the name, philosophical counseling, coaching, consultation. Um, I struggle with all of them to some extent. If I were to choose a name, it would be a personal philosophical facilitator. But I don't think it's very catchy and it's not very good for SEO.
Then what would you call the actual session? Consultation, counseling session?
Yeah, well, counseling is the word that a lot of people use. So I use it for that reason. There's an element of coaching to it. There's an element of mentoring. There's an element of just straightforward educational, sort of teaching. Um, I think of it. as a philosophical inquiry, if I were to put it simply. And I'm facilitating a philosophical inquiry. That's what I'm doing.
Okay.
Philosophical conversation is another way I would think about it, because we're drawing on the Socratic approach. But philosophical inquiry, which of course is what PHI stands for, which is the method for working in schools that I developed, PHI capital E, PHI-E. And that stands for philosophical inquiry. And what I do, either in the classroom or with a client, is I'm simply facilitating that philosophical inquiry.
Sounds good, I think.
Great. Well, okay.
All right. So thank you, Pete. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's been fun.